And so now we find ourselves in a quagmire, and this all kind of blends together in that we're talking about closing borders, but how soon we forget that 8 years ago or previous administration ago, we had different thoughts, different feelings, different ideas. And so stitched into this constitutionally, theologically, and socially, into this political construct about idealism. And what ideas do you follow? Which ones do you agree with? And behind all of that is what I'm going to get out of it or what I'm going to lose. So I believe we ought to enforce our laws. And it appears that in not doing so, we've got a quagmire. Where we're talking, if you're talking immigration, you're talking about 11 million, and they're not all from one particular country, like the argument tries to get constructed. And current knowledge is telling us people coming across the borders are coming from multiple countries. I believe we ought to take care of home. I believe we have a process. I've seen it work. Do we need to expand the amount of visas that we give for technology or for healthcare or any other reasons? Yes. But there's a way to come to the United States. And so I think we ought to stay true to that tenet. But if our processes are not working and our system is not doing what it needs to do, then those persons who are in accountable positions should stop blaming and fighting ideology and make sure that we're upholding the laws, because I believe that we weren't doing that in a particular kind of way. And so now we have people in our country who've had children in our country, and we're somewhat putting them in a precarious place of saying you have to leave now. We're going to have to be a part of solving the problem that we let get created. From a religious standpoint, I think we have to pray. I think we have to trust, we have to believe, and we have to look at the Bible, or even if you're studying the Quran or what have you, and see the diversity of people which are bigger than a specific faith. No matter what faith you practice, there's a diversity of people behind that, a diversity of their perspective and what have you. So there's no one size that fits all. We're going to have to learn how to figure this out together, regardless of religious construct or political ideology.
Out at school, you have had students post things, write things, set them up. What impact has that had, and how have people responded to that?
We're feeling positive for one reason. We've noticed, the Office of Diversity and Multicultural Affairs, that we need to continue to be better listeners of our students. And our philosophy is, I don't care what you teach, I don't care what your administrative position is or your title is, I don't even care how beautiful the grounds and the buildings are. If there are no students at IPFW, there's no job. There's no reason for anybody to teach, there's no reason for anybody to administrate. And so listening and hearing our students and knowing what they're thinking and integrating that with the fabulous job that our faculty do in a lot of cases to spread knowledge and to share knowledge. And sometimes there's disagreements. We believe very strongly as a university that that particular wall was an avenue to open up the voice of the student. The second part of that is the university is deeply steeped, and we believe very strongly in the First Amendment. And people can say what they want to say, but at the point it becomes a threat, at the point that it infringes upon other people's rights or abilities, the First Amendment is pretty clear of those tenets. So that wall is a free speech wall, and it's been interesting, but ahead of Mizzou, ahead of a number of things that have happened in our country, but also in the backdrop of your Michael Brown situations and hands up, don't shoot, that wall is a place for people to come, to express, and maybe let some air out of it in some ways, but in other ways to create some more tensions about what we need to talk about.
And, that's one of the things that I know that you've spoken about, is that race is an issue in this country, and we talk around it. And is this starting to be there? Do you see people more starting to talk about it and engage each other, even though it might not always be the easiest thing in the world?
Yeah, well, it's like theology. All theology arises out of history and context. And we have a history. We have a distant history. A lot of people talk about slavery. We have a not so far removed history where, in particular, when you're talking about race and African Americans, where our forefathers and foremothers, they weren't being gunned down as much as they were being shot or sicking dogs and hoses and things. So we have a history that we have to, I don't care who you are, that we have to be conscious of. And people are taking that history and looking at it, and they have feelings in a present context, and then we attach that. A lot of situations handle their own merit. But at the end of the day, race is something we're not comfortable with. Are we better? Yes. Are we stronger? Yes. Has the house of God helped that? Yes. Have universities helped that? Yes. Have just a good, common, working person wanting to do right? Yes. But at the same time, we're comfortable with economic disparity, and if we're winning, we don't say anything. If we're losing, we're crying. We become very comfortable with the LGBTQ agenda, and there are things moving in Indiana House right now and throughout this country, and we can talk about that and what we need to do. But when it comes to race, it's like this invisible thing, and if you raise the flag, it's as if you have some kind of mental or social disorder. No, race is something that we need to deal with, and I think that the largest macro idea we have is how this Congress has acted toward our president, forgetting that he's biracial and seeing him as, quote, the black president, and he has led this nation as best he could with equity in the forefront, I believe, of his ideology, but it's like taken for us to give to somebody else. And so race is a volatile situation, but it doesn't have to be, because once you get into the subject, then you start to realize there's a lot more commonality than there is distance. So, black and white, Mexicans coming across the border, now keep the Syrians out. It's still race. It's just become amalgamated, and you have the history, but whew, we've created a quagmire because we've not dealt with race and how we feel about race, and whose country really does the United States belong to? It belongs to all of us.
Well, you mentioned that about people, and that shows up from what you're saying. Is like we hear about Mexicans, problem. We hear about Syrians, problem. But we don't hear about European immigrants, Bosnians, Czechs being a problem when they came here. I don't remember that. Maybe there was, but I don't remember the same type of reaction. Or I don't hear people saying, let's close the Canadian border.
Exactly. Because again, it's ideology, and it's who we're comfortable with and what we're not comfortable with. And it's hard for, I believe, this is me talking, Ken Christmon, for a legislator to argue we're not letting the Syrians in, but then you had a blind eye or a back turn over what's happened and evolved over the last 15 years, even with the previous administration or the one before that. And so you can't hand pick what you're going to slice out of the pie, because that's not who we are as a country. That's not who we've ever been. And as much as we talk about who's coming or wants to come, you also have historically a group of people who were forced to come here. Didn't ask, but were forced to come here and came here in the slave trade. So there's a lot of history, there's a lot of context, and it's as much individual discussions as it is institutional discussions that happen with, say, for instance, institutional racism. But at the end of the day, I really believe this, and I really know that this is probably a fundamental root. We as people have to just act on the goodness and the tenets of this country. Because if we're going to wait on the government to legislate something, and I know this may sound a little sensational, but the facts are there. This has been the poorest performing Congress that we've ever seen. And I think at some point, history will soon tell what some of those things were that had to do with race, economic disparity. But how do 2% of the people control 90 or 95% of the wealth? So it's economics, it's social, it's religion, and now we want to start closing the borders.
I'm not going to keep you much longer, but you touched on something, and people talk about redistributing wealth, and they get all upset about this. But from the standpoint of a pastor, from a man of God, what does the Bible tell us about how we're really supposed to treat people?
Well, I mean, it's love. And love is a relevant word, but it's a contentious word. Because love doesn't always mean I like you. Love doesn't always mean, and so the Bible says, love your neighbor as yourself. I don't get to choose anymore who my neighbors are. Used to be there was red line and all those things, but physically I don't choose who my neighbor. The beauty of our church, we don't control and regulate who comes in and who's not. We don't put a meter out front and say if you have a ticket or if you're this or you're that. So the Bible is very clear. Love your neighbor as yourself. Uh, the Bible also tells us that the tenets of love, it's patience, it's kindness, it's goodness, it's gentleness, it's self-control. And so God and his word, wherever you get it from out of the Bible, God constantly reminds us of one thing, that we're to be inclusive and that we are to be appreciative of his goodness and the earth that he's put here for us to live on and to figure out how to work it out together. So without zeroing in any one place, the tenets of love and respecting your neighbor and appreciating and even disagreeing are the things that God wants us to do. We should never be in a place where for my humanity to live and to be good that I need to oppress somebody else.